Daniel Carter had been living alone on the edge of the wild country for many years. His tent was set up near a stream, surrounded by cottonwood trees that bent with the evening wind. Life on the frontier was not easy, but Daniel had grown used to it. He had once been part of a busy ranch, but he had chosen to live away from crowds and noise. The land was rough, but the quiet nights and open skies gave him peace. He spent his days hunting, gathering wood, and mending his gear. His tent, though simple, had become a safe place that protected him from storms and long, cold nights. On one such night, the sky was dark and heavy with clouds. The wind rushed across the land, carrying with it the smell of rain and dust. Daniel sat by a small fire inside his tent, sharpening his knife and waiting for the storm to pass. Suddenly he heard a faint noise outside, something different from the usual rustle of leaves or cry of an animal. It was soft, like footsteps dragging slowly through the dirt. He froze for a moment, his hand tightening on the handle of his knife. Out here one could never be too careful. Wild animals roamed freely, and strangers could mean trouble. Daniel carefully pulled back the flap of his tent and peered into the darkness. At first he saw nothing, only the shadows of trees swaying against the dim light of the moon. Then as the clouds shifted, he caught sight of a figure moving weakly toward him. It was small, thin, and unsteady. The figure stumbled, then collapsed just a few steps away from his tent. Without thinking, Daniel rushed forward. There on the ground lay a young Apache girl. Her hair was tangled, her clothes were worn and torn, and her face showed the marks of hunger and exhaustion. Her eyes, though half closed, still carried a spark of strength, a sign that she had been fighting hard to stay alive. Daniel bent down and gently helped her sit up. "You're safe," he said softly, though he knew she might not understand his words. The girl did not reply, but her breathing was heavy and uneven. She looked at him with guarded eyes, too tired to resist, yet still watchful. Daniel could see that she had gone without food for a long time. Her hands trembled as if even the effort of holding herself up was too much. He carried her into his tent and laid her down near the fire. She was light, far too light for someone her age, and it worried him. Reaching into his supplies, Daniel pulled out a small piece of bread and some dried meat. He placed them carefully on a plate and held it out to her. At first she hesitated, as if unsure whether to trust him, but hunger soon overcame doubt. She reached out slowly, her fingers shaking, and began to eat in small, careful bites. Daniel watched silently, not wanting to frighten her. He could tell she was proud, too proud to appear desperate, but she was starving. Each bite seemed to bring a little more life back to her face. She ate slowly, as if trying to make every crumb last, and drank the water he offered her with both hands wrapped around the cup. The storm outside grew louder, with rain pattering against the tent and thunder rolling in the distance. But inside, the small fire gave warmth and light. Daniel kept his distance, knowing she needed space. He studied her quietly, trying to guess what might have brought her here. The girl finally looked up from the food. Her lips parted, and in a voice faint but steady, she spoke a single word. "Ayanna." Daniel understood it was her name. He nodded respectfully. "Ayanna," he repeated, giving her a small smile. She did not speak again, but her eyes softened just a little. She pulled the blanket he offered around herself and leaned back against the tent wall. The firelight flickered across her face, showing both weariness and courage. Daniel thought about what it must have taken for her to reach his camp. The land outside was harsh, with wild animals, deep canyons, and men who might not treat her kindly. For her to arrive in such a state meant she had been walking for days, maybe longer, with no one to help her. He felt a deep sense of respect for her strength, even as his heart ached at the sight of her suffering. The night went on quietly. The storm continued, but the tent stood strong and the fire kept the chill away. Ayanna finished eating and curled up on the blanket, her body finally giving in to sleep. Daniel sat nearby, listening to the rain and keeping watch. He could not help but wonder what story lay behind her silence. Why was she alone? Where was her family? What dangers had forced her to wander into the wilderness? Though she was a stranger, he felt a responsibility toward her. Out here, life was fragile and every person mattered. He remembered his own past, times when he had been lost, cold, and hungry, saved only because someone had shown him kindness. Now it was his turn to do the same. As the night deepened, Daniel added more wood to the fire and checked to make sure Ayanna was comfortable. She stirred once, mumbling softly in her sleep, but did not wake. He pulled the flap of the tent tighter to keep the rain out and settled back on his blanket. Sleep did not come easily to him. He was too alert, too aware of the new presence beside him. Yet there was also a sense of peace he had not felt in years. The storm finally began to fade, leaving behind only the soft dripping of water from the trees. Daniel looked over at the sleeping girl, wrapped in the blanket, her face calm at last. In that moment he knew that this meeting was no accident. Life on the frontier was filled with chance encounters, but some felt heavier, more meaningful, as if guided by something greater. By the time dawn began to lighten the horizon, Daniel was still awake, watching over her. The girl named Ayana had come into his life by chance, but he already sensed that her presence would change his days to come. She was not just a wanderer seeking shelter for the night. She was a soul carrying a story, a mystery, and perhaps even a new beginning. The morning sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pale gold. Birds began to sing among the cottonwood trees, shaking off the raindrops left behind by the night storm. The land smelled fresh and alive after the heavy rain. Inside the tent, Daniel stretched his tired arms. He had barely slept, but he did not mind. His thoughts had been fixed on the young Apache girl resting only a few feet away. Ayana was still curled up in the blanket he had given her. For the first time, her breathing was even and calm, unlike the shallow gasps of the night before. Daniel watched her with quiet relief. She had survived the storm, and the food he offered seemed to have given her a little strength back. When she finally stirred awake, her eyes opened slowly. For a brief moment she looked around in confusion, as if unsure of where she was. Then her gaze landed on Daniel sitting cross-legged near the fire, and her expression softened just a little. She remembered. She knew she was safe. Daniel nodded at her gently. "Good morning, Ayana." She did not answer in words, but she gave the smallest nod in return. Her silence was not cold or unfriendly. It was the silence of someone who had learned to guard her world carefully. She picked up the cup of water he had left by her side and sipped slowly. Daniel had no wish to press her with questions, though curiosity burned within him. Instead, he decided to let actions build trust. He broke a piece of bread and handed it to her. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted it. She ate quietly, every bite careful, as if she had been trained never to waste a single crumb. "Do you understand English?" Daniel asked softly, not expecting much. Ayana raised her eyes to him and after a pause gave another small nod. It was enough to give him hope. He smiled lightly. "Then we can talk, but only if you want to." The girl lowered her gaze again, chewing slowly. She was not ready to share her story, but Daniel did not mind. In the silence, he found meaning. He began moving about the tent, folding his gear, cleaning his rifle, and preparing his morning tasks. Ayana watched him, her dark eyes following every movement. When Daniel stepped outside to fetch more wood for the fire, she rose quietly and followed him. She did not walk close, but she did not remain behind either. He glanced back, noticing her small frame against the sunlight. She was still weak, but her steps seemed steadier than the night before. Together, though without speaking, they collected branches and stacked them near the tent. Daniel worked with practiced ease while Ayana mimicked him, carrying smaller pieces of wood in her arms. He saw the effort she put into it and admired her strength, though her body was clearly tired. As the morning grew brighter, Daniel decided to prepare a better meal. He set a pot on the fire, filling it with water from the stream, adding dried beans and a little meat. Ayana crouched near him, her eyes fixed on the bubbling pot. The smell filled the air, rich and comforting. When the food was ready, Daniel gave her the first bowl. She accepted it with quiet dignity, holding it carefully in both hands. She ate slowly again, each spoonful bringing color back to her cheeks. Daniel ate his portion after her, not out of hunger but out of respect. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the sound of the fire and the distant cry of an eagle above the canyon. Then, to Daniel's surprise, Ayana spoke. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but steady enough. "You help me." Daniel looked at her, meeting her gaze. He nodded. "Yes, you were hungry. You were tired. Anyone would help." She shook her head slightly. "Not all." Her words were simple, but their weight was heavy. She had seen enough of the world to know that kindness was rare. Daniel felt a pang in his chest. He wondered what hardships she had faced, what people had turned her away before she stumbled upon his camp. "You're safe here," he told her, his tone gentle but firm. "No harm will come to you in my tent." For the first time, he saw a flicker of trust in her eyes. It was faint, like a candle struggling against the wind, but it was there. As the day moved on, Ayanna began to reveal small pieces of herself, not in long stories, but in gestures and short words. She showed him how she could braid thin ropes from dry grass, a skill that spoke of her people's traditions. She pointed at the sky, naming the eagle in her own language, her voice filled with quiet pride. Daniel listened carefully, repeating the word until she nodded in approval. They had built a bridge, fragile but real. Later that afternoon, Daniel decided to fetch fresh water from the stream. Ayanna insisted on coming along. The path was muddy from the night storm, and her feet slipped more than once, but she did not complain. She carried a small jug, filling it beside him, her reflection clear in the moving water. On the way back, Daniel noticed her glance around often, scanning the trees and hills. It was not fear that filled her eyes, but awareness. She was used to watching her surroundings, ready for danger at every step. He realized she had lived most of her young life on guard, never letting herself be fully at ease. Back at the camp, as the sun dipped lower, Daniel worked on repairing a tear in his saddlebag. Ayanna sat nearby, mending her own torn sleeve with a needle and thread he had given her. The quiet moment felt almost like family, though no words passed between them. As night returned, the fire flickered inside the tent once more. Daniel handed her another piece of bread. She accepted it without hesitation this time. He noticed that she had begun to arrange some of his things, moving them gently to the side, creating a small corner for herself. It was subtle, but Daniel understood it. She was no longer just a guest passing through. She was beginning to make the tent her shelter, too. Before lying down to sleep, she looked at him and spoke again, her words simple but clear. "My name means blossom," Daniel smiled. "Ayanna, eternal blossom," he repeated. She gave a small nod, then wrapped herself in the blanket. Her eyes closed, but there was a calmness about her now, a quiet sign of trust. Daniel sat awake once more, listening to the sounds of the night. The bond between them had grown stronger, even in such a short time. He knew the days ahead would not be easy. There were questions unanswered, dangers that might come, and a world outside that did not always welcome strangers. But for now, within the walls of his small canvas tent, there was peace. And in that peace, Daniel felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose he had not known for years. The sun was climbing high when Daniel woke the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and the air fresh. Drops of dew glistened on the grass outside the tent, and the sound of the stream carried gently through the trees. For a moment, Daniel sat still, enjoying the quiet of a new day. Then he turned his eyes to the corner of the tent where Ayanna had slept. She was already awake. He noticed she had taken his small pot and cleaned it by the stream before he had risen. His tools, which he usually kept scattered, were now stacked neatly to one side. Even his boots had been moved closer to the entrance, as if she had decided everything in the tent needed to have a place. Daniel gave a small smile to himself. It was not simply tidying, this was something more. It was her way of saying she was no longer just a guest. She was marking her presence in the space, making it partly hers. When she noticed him watching, Ayanna's eyes flickered with quiet determination. She did not speak, but she did not need to. Daniel understood the message in her actions. She had chosen to stay. He stood and stretched his arms. "You're an early riser," he said softly. She did not answer in words, but there was a calm pride in her face. She picked up the blanket she had used and folded it neatly before placing it in the corner. Then she walked outside, her steps steady, and began gathering dry sticks for the fire. Daniel followed her, amused but impressed. "You've already claimed the chores, have you?" he muttered under his breath. They prepared breakfast together. He cooked beans and bread, and she arranged the bowls and cups as though it was a ritual. She ate beside him, no longer showing the hesitation of the first night. She even looked at him directly, her eyes steady and unafraid. When the meal was done, Ayanna surprised him again. She picked up his canteen and walked to the stream without being asked. She filled it and returned, placing it carefully at his side. Daniel realized this was no longer just about survival. This was her way of building trust step by step. Later in the morning, Daniel decided to check the traps he had set in the woods. He whistled softly, calling his horse, a brown Mustang named Arrow. Ayana's eyes widened slightly when the horse trotted up to him. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out timidly to touch Arrow's mane. At first the horse snorted, but Daniel patted its neck, calming it, and nodded for Ayana to try again. Her hand brushed the animal's fur gently. Arrow stood still as if sensing her careful spirit. Ayana's lips curved into the faintest smile. It was the first time Daniel had seen such an expression from her. "You've made a friend," Daniel said with a grin. The girl glanced at him, then at the horse, and nodded once. Together, they rode out to the traps, Ayana sitting behind Daniel on the saddle. She did not cling tightly, but she held steady, her balance strong. Daniel felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, not just because she was behind him, but because she was slowly giving him her trust. They found 2 rabbits caught in the traps. Daniel skinned them quickly and wrapped the meat, explaining each step as he worked. To his surprise, Ayana leaned in closely, watching with keen eyes, as if memorizing every detail. When he handed her one of the cleaned skins, she folded it neatly and tucked it into her bag. On the ride back, the land spread wide before them. Hills rolled into valleys and the horizon seemed endless. Daniel had always loved the openness of the frontier, but for the first time he felt he was not alone in it. When they returned to camp, Daniel prepared the rabbit stew while Ayana built the fire. She moved with growing confidence now, her small hands quick and sure. She even added herbs she had gathered along the path, surprising Daniel with knowledge he did not have. The stew tasted richer than usual, and when he complimented her, Ayana's cheeks colored faintly, though she said nothing. As the day wore on, Daniel noticed more small signs of change. Ayana began humming softly while she worked, a tune unfamiliar to him, likely from her people. It was gentle and haunting, carrying with it memories she did not speak aloud. She arranged stones around the fire pit, making it stronger against the wind. She swept the tent floor with a bundle of grass. Every action said the same thing: "This is my place too." When evening came, Daniel sat by the fire sharpening his knife. Ayana sat across from him, weaving thin strips of grass into a small braid. The firelight danced between them, painting their faces in warm glow. At last, Daniel broke the silence. "You've made yourself at home," he said gently. Ayana looked up, her eyes steady. She touched the braid she had made and placed it on the floor near his boots. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "My tent too," she said. The words were simple, but their meaning struck deep. Daniel understood it was more than a statement, it was a declaration. In her culture, small acts like arranging things or leaving a token carried heavy meaning. She was marking his tent as hers as well. Daniel's chest tightened with emotion. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "Yes, our tent." For the first time, Ayana allowed herself to smile fully. It was not wide or loud, but it was real. A smile of belonging. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, Daniel lay awake thinking about the changes unfolding. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to share a space, to feel someone's presence shaping his daily life. Yet here was a girl who had arrived on the edge of death and, in only 2 days, had carved a place for herself in his world. He realized that her act of marking the tent was not only about survival, it was about choosing him. Out of all the dangers and strangers she might have met, she had chosen to trust him, to tie her path with his. As the fire burned low and Ayana drifted into sleep, Daniel whispered to himself, "So be it." He closed his eyes, knowing that from this day forward, nothing would be quite the same again. The following days passed with a rhythm that was both new and familiar. Daniel, who had been used to silence and solitude, now found himself sharing every task with Ayana. She moved quietly but with purpose, learning his ways while showing her own. Her presence filled the camp with something different, something that Daniel could only describe as life. But the world outside their small camp did not remain silent for long. Word began to spread among nearby settlers that an Apache girl had been seen near the woods. In towns and camps scattered along the frontier, suspicion often rose quickly when it came to native tribes. Fear and misunderstanding had built walls between people, and any stranger who looked different was viewed with doubt. One afternoon, while Daniel was mending his saddle by the fire, 2 men rode into his camp. Their horses kicked up dust as they approached, and their eyes searched the tent with open curiosity. "Morning, Carter," one of them called. His name was Holt, a tall man with a scar across his cheek. He was known among the settlers for being sharp-tongued and suspicious of anyone he did not trust. The second man was younger, quieter, but followed Holt like a shadow. Daniel stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Morning," he replied calmly. Holt's eyes shifted toward the tent. "Word is you've got company, an Apache girl." His voice carried the weight of accusation, not curiosity. Before Daniel could answer, Ayanna stepped out from the tent. She stood tall, her dark eyes steady. Though her small frame looked fragile beside the men's horses, she did not flinch or hide. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, as if daring them to question her place. Holt narrowed his eyes. "There she is." "Just what I heard." He spat to the side. "You know the trouble this can bring? Folks don't take kindly to seeing one of her kind living so close." Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "She's under my protection. She's done no harm to anyone." The younger man glanced uneasily at Ayanna, then back at Holt. But Holt's gaze remained cold. "Protection or not, people will talk. You'll find yourself shut out if you keep her here." Daniel stepped closer, his tone steady. "Then let them talk." "She stays." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Ayanna stood still, watching, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Holt finally shook his head, muttering, "You're a fool, Carter." With that, he tugged the reins and turned his horse around. The younger man followed, casting one last uncertain glance before disappearing down the trail. When the camp was quiet again, Daniel turned to Ayanna. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and gratitude. She did not speak, but she did not need to. The way her shoulders relaxed told him enough. He had stood for her, and she knew it. That evening, as the fire burned low, Ayanna helped Daniel prepare supper. She worked silently, but her movements were softer, less guarded than before. At last she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You defend me!" Daniel looked at her across the fire. "Of course. You're not alone anymore." For the first time, her eyes shone with something deeper than gratitude. It was trust, pure and steady. The next morning, Daniel noticed a change. Ayanna no longer hovered quietly at the edge of his tasks. Instead, she worked beside him with confidence. She gathered firewood, carried water, and even tried to help with the snares. Though her hands were small, she moved with determination, refusing to be a burden. When Daniel praised her efforts, she gave a faint smile. It was rare, but it warmed him more than the fire ever could. One day, as they were walking by the stream, Ayanna suddenly crouched and pointed at the ground. Daniel followed her gaze and saw tracks, deer, fresh from the morning. She looked up at him, her eyes alight with silent knowledge. Together they followed the trail. Ayanna moved like the forest itself guided her steps. Daniel was struck by her skill. Though young, she carried the wisdom of her people, wisdom born of living close to the land. When they finally caught sight of the deer grazing in the meadow, she motioned for him to stop. Her hand lifted slowly, pointing toward a better angle. Daniel raised his rifle, waited, and fired cleanly. The deer fell, and they worked together to carry the meat back to camp. That night the stew was rich, and for the first time laughter, soft and fleeting, escaped Ayanna's lips. Daniel was so startled by the sound that he nearly dropped his spoon. But when he saw her trying to hide her smile, he laughed too. Life at the camp was changing. It was no longer the life of one man surviving in silence. It had become a shared life, built with two hands instead of one. Ayanna's presence touched everything. His meals, his chores, his quiet evenings. She was no longer just surviving. She was living, and she was giving him reason to live more fully as well. But the outside world did not forget. A week later, while Daniel was trading supplies in a nearby town, he heard whispers behind him. "Carter's keeping an Apache girl in his camp. He'll bring trouble on himself." Daniel ignored the words, but he could feel the eyes on him. Some people looked at him with disapproval, while others with curiosity. A few offered a nod of respect as if admiring his courage. But he knew the line between respect and hatred was thin. When he returned to camp, Ayanna was waiting by the fire. The moment she saw his face, she seemed to sense what had happened. Her eyes grew troubled, but Daniel shook his head. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll face it together." That night, as the wind swept across the land, Ayanna sat close to the fire, her hands weaving grass into patterns. She looked up at Daniel and spoke softly. My people. Gone. The words were few but heavy. Daniel froze, his heart tightening. She lowered her gaze, her fingers trembling as they worked. I walk, alone, many days, she continued haltingly. No food, no place, then. Your tent. Her voice broke and silence filled the air. Daniel leaned forward, his tone gentle. You're not alone anymore, Ayanna, not now. Not ever again. Her eyes lifted to his, shining with unshed tears. She reached for one of his tools, carefully placing it beside her woven braid as if marking it with her presence again. Daniel understood. She was no longer just a girl seeking shelter. She was choosing this life, this bond. He felt the weight of her trust settle on him like armor. As the fire burned low and the stars stretched across the sky, Daniel knew that the world outside might judge them, but within this tent there was a bond that no one could break. The days turned into weeks, and the small camp by the stream no longer felt like the lonely outpost it had once been. Daniel had lived in silence for years, but now, the sound of Ayanna's footsteps, her soft humming, and her quiet laughter filled the space with life. She was no longer a guest. She was a part of the place, and her presence gave Daniel's life new meaning. Each morning they shared simple routines. Daniel would saddle Arrow, his horse, while Ayanna prepared food or gathered water. She had grown stronger, her thin frame filling out as steady meals gave her energy. Her eyes no longer looked hollow with hunger. Instead, they shone with determination and quiet pride. She continued to mark her place in small but powerful ways. She arranged stones in front of the tent, making a little path. She carved simple designs on sticks and placed them by the fire. She even took one of Daniel's old scarves, mended its torn edges, and tied it to the tent pole. To anyone else, these might have seemed like small acts, but Daniel understood. These were her ways of saying, I belong here. This is my home too. One morning, as Daniel was fixing his saddle, Ayanna came to sit beside him. She held a bundle of feathers she had found near the stream. Without asking, she tied them carefully to the end of his rope. Then she looked at him and said in her soft, steady voice, Now, it is ours. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a vow. He nodded slowly, touched more deeply than he could say. But life on the frontier was never without challenge. Rumors continued to spread. Some settlers kept their distance, while others grew hostile. Daniel could feel the tension in the air whenever he rode into town. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone tried to interfere. That day came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, while Daniel was chopping wood near the camp, he heard the sound of horses approaching. He turned quickly, his axe still in hand, and saw 3 men riding toward him. Holt was among them, his sharp eyes fixed on the tent. Carter, Holt called, his voice hard. We warned you. Daniel straightened, his stance steady. She's done nothing wrong. Holt's lip curled. She doesn't belong here. Folks are nervous. We can't have her living among us. Before Daniel could answer, Ayanna stepped out of the tent. She stood tall, her face calm, though Daniel could see the tension in her eyes. She did not hide behind him. Instead, she moved to stand beside him, her presence small compared to the men on horseback but strong in spirit. Holt's expression darkened. You'd risk everything for her? Daniel's voice was clear. I already have, and I'd do it again. For a moment, the air was thick with silence. The other 2 men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Holt glared at Daniel, then at Ayanna, but finally spat to the ground and turned his horse. You'll regret this, he muttered before riding off. Daniel watched them disappear into the distance. When he turned back, Ayanna's eyes were on him. She did not speak, but the way she placed her hand gently on his arm told him everything. She trusted him completely. That night, as they sat by the fire, Ayanna finally shared more of her story. Her words came slowly, broken but heartfelt. My family, gone, village burned. I walked many nights. No one help. Only you, she paused, her eyes fixed on the flames. Then she looked at him, her voice steady. I choose you. Daniel's chest tightened. Her words were more than gratitude, they were a vow, a bond formed by survival and choice. He reached across the fire and took the small braid she had made days before. He tied it to his belt, a sign that he accepted her choice. From that moment on, there was no doubt. They were bound together, not by blood or law, but by trust and loyalty. The days that followed were not easy. Suspicion from outsiders remained, but Daniel and Ayanna stood firm. Together they hunted, cooked, and kept their camp strong. She wove baskets to carry supplies while he taught her how to use the rifle safely. She, in turn, taught him how to read the land, how to find water, how to follow animal tracks, and how to listen to the wind. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Daniel no longer thought of his tent as his. It was theirs. Every corner carried her touch. Every sound of her voice filled him with quiet strength. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Daniel watched Ayanna place another token near the fire, a stone she had carved with small marks. He asked her what it meant. She looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. "It means home." Daniel's heart swelled. For years he had thought of the frontier as a lonely place, a land that took more than it gave. But now, as he looked at the girl who had once stumbled into his tent hungry and exhausted, he realized something had changed. The land was no longer empty. It was full, because she had filled it with meaning. From that day on, whenever outsiders questioned them, Daniel did not waver. He introduced Ayanna not as a stranger, but as part of his life, his companion. Some continued to mutter, but others began to see the quiet strength between them and respected it. Time passed, and the bond between them became unshakable. They were two souls from different worlds, brought together by chance yet tied by choice. Daniel often thought back to the night he first found her collapsed outside his tent. Had he ignored the sound or closed his flap tighter against the storm, their paths might never have crossed. But fate had guided her steps to his fire, and from that moment everything had changed. Now, as he sat by the fire with Ayanna beside him, he knew the truth. She had not just marked his tent with her small axe, she had marked his life, his heart, his future, and for Daniel that was enough.